You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. One important note before we get into this episode. We recorded this, I think, about a month or so before police murdered George Floyd. And I suspect that our conversation would have gone to a different direction in places if we had recorded this more recently. So I wanted to put that out there. I'm also going to be leaving several links at the bottom of our show notes that are resources for places that you can donate money and a number of articles about ways that white people like myself can help reduce suffering and reduce systemic racism. And finally, before I introduce our show, I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be donating a portion of the money that comes to us from Patreon this month. And I'm going to be donating it to Reclaim the Block. And I'll read a quote off of their website here. They are a Minneapolis community and city council member driven organization that moves money from the police department into other areas of the city's budget that truly promote community, health, and safety. They say, "We believe health, safety, and resiliency exist without police of any kind. We organize around policies that strengthen community-led safety initiatives and reduce reliance on police departments. We do not believe that increased regulation of or public engagement with the police will lead to a safer community, as community testimony and documented police conduct suggest otherwise." And like I said, there will be links to other organizations that support Black Lives Matter and bail funds and a number of other organizations. So I really suggest you take a look and see what you can do. On today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at an article from the website Spiked Online, which is titled "Being a Goth in a Pandemic." We'll be spending a lot of time examining when and how goths deal with death, the impact that the pandemic has had on us, and also Halloween for some reason. We've also got a review of the new album from Mystic Priestess, our Sinister Suggestions, and more. So as always, I am the Count. I am here with my co-host Trey, and our guest this month is Ryan from the band Witchhands. So Ryan, if you don't mind, we'd like to start just with a sort of introduction, your kind of origin story, how you got into goth or alternative culture, and then please let us know a little about Witchhands and where people can find your music.
My name is Ryan Flint. I am the singer and occasionally competent musician in Witchhands. We're a deathrock band out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, although some of the purists would say we're not proper deathrock. Although, frankly, I don't know what else you would call us, so whatever. I'm not trying to be Roz Williams.
And it's not real deathrock.
Right? How dare we? Let's see. I was born and schooled in Boulder County in Colorado, which, if you're not from the area, is called the People's Republic. It's very lily white, very not leftist, but liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a liberal college town. That's Boulder in a nutshell.
And also very affluent. Like,
yes,
most of the population has a higher degree, tech companies, that sort of thing. So very insular, very different from other parts of the state, I would say. After public school. I moved down to Colorado Springs, down in height of the Bush era in the 2000s. And this is where Air Force, now Space Force, focus on the family.
That's right. Focus on the Family is from Boulder or from
Colorado
Springs.
Colorado Springs.
Yeah, they would say that after every episode, and I know because I listened to.
There's an Army
episode.
post there too. Yeah, there are 3 Air Force bases in the
NORAD
region. Well, NORAD's kind of been decommed, but it's still kind of running. And then the Air Force Academy.
Yep.
And then Army post.
So that's where we get some of our anger. Although, honestly, it's mellowed down a lot. Gentrification up in Denver has really diluted the conservatism down here.
Right.
Ever since weed was legalized. And they won't legalize it down here. So, yeah, that's interesting. So, let's see. I went to film school up in Denver for a while and then realized I didn't want to be job hunting after every project or move to LA. So, moved back down to the Springs, or got gentrified out of Denver, depending on how you look at it. And started up Witchhands with our local DJ and a longtime buddy of mine and an ex-drug addict who hadn't drummed in about 7 years. And a guy who, right before we released our EP, decided to split and start LA Arson. So, now my roommate / my girlfriend's husband plays bass and does all of our production and stuff.
Nice.
It's a good move, yeah. Let's see. We've been at it since the start of the Trump era, actually. Our first show was the day of the Women's March all over the country. Yeah.
Okay.
So are you insinuating it's a very political band, or you're just political personally? This is just, I ask because it's a recurring theme on the show.
I mean, I would say I am to some degree. I'm trying to move from being a bystander and more active, but I definitely pay a lot of attention to policies and keep getting slowly radicalized. But I mean, we kind of run the gamut.
So I've got to ask a little bit about Colorado Springs, because I lived in Colorado Springs between 2008 and 2012.
Oh, okay.
And was involved in the scene a bit down there. I went to the underground fairly frequently.
R.I.P.
And hung out with that. Yeah, I was just looking it up today to see what's going on down there, and I saw that I guess the Zodiac is the only current pseudo club space ish.
Yeah, it's kind of a continuity. Somebody passed the torch from the underground DJs to the Zodiac DJs, but basically the space was mismanaged, and then infighting in our small town scene kind of broke out. But
yeah, and
Zodiac's
it looks like the DJ who was there when I was doing was mostly Gary Merrill. Looks like he moved to Pueblo.
Yeah. That's about 45 minutes away for all the outsiders.
So was that part of the schism in the scene?
Yeah, part of it. There were 2 goth nights, I want to say, from the 2 different groups of DJs from the underground, and then just kind of morphed into being the Zodiac as the only game in town.
That's too bad, because the underground was a really nice space.
It was, but when we got those 100-year floods and rains, the entire basement got flooded, and it still smells like mold, and the floorboards are still warped. So, nobody wants to fix that.
Yeah. So how is the scene out there right now? I mean, other than schismed and kind of shaky, but still something going on there, or?
Still something going on every Tuesday when there's not a pandemic.
Right.
I think they're doing some live streams, some of the DJs, but I mean,
that's what I was seeing on the Zodiac Facebook page.
If the thing persists, I have a feeling the Zodiac and a lot of other places will get shuttered. Some of the venues in Denver and Colorado Springs are already going away. It's just kind of going to accelerate gentrification, I think.
That'll be too bad because I thought it was a good. The town was a really sort of nice combination of a laid back, sort of easy-ish small town type thing, but enough city life to have alternative venues and club spaces and art galleries and stuff like that. But was also within easy shouting distance of just getting out into the nature and hiking down a ravine or going into the woods and no longer hearing traffic. So I really liked that sort of really good combination of the urbane and the rural and all of that when I was out there.
Yeah, I really ought to take advantage of it more.
So do you play mostly in Denver as far as with your band, or do you have a lot of gigs in the Colorado Springs area?
Probably about 50-50. I mean, there's a lot more opportunity up in Denver and a lot bigger crowds, so we tend to favor that, but we've played the Springs till they're sick of us practically.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, cool. It's good to hear that there's something still kind of squirming out down there, and I kind of miss the area, but it's been a while since I've been out there.
Yeah, it's less hectic than Denver because their population seems like they add 100,000 people every year. Nobody wants to be in the Springs as much, so it's stayed a lot more chill. On the other hand, you can't get people down from Denver to the Springs, no matter how many goth fests or anything else we throw down here. So,
yeah,
what can you do?
Yep, that's how it is.
So cool. So this is the title of this is Being a Goth in a Pandemic. And well, actually, you both brought up virtual DJ stuff. I should probably ask to do this kind of what seems to have become a prerequisite on every podcast I listen to ask, like, how are you dealing with life during a pandemic? Or more specifically, experiencing goth now. How are you feeling about that? Because at this point, my general feeling is some of the live streams have been fun when I have, friends in the chat that I know and I can talk to. But in general, you don't have the atmosphere and experience of entering a different space. You don't get to have the kind of in-depth conversation with people or walk around and see other people that you haven't seen in a while. It's just, you can only do so much, right? I've seen some cool live streams from bands, maybe a couple that I thought were interesting. But in general, it's just, I don't know. It doesn't feel the same to me. I just listened to, we have a technical episode, but their perspective was we're living in the future and it's super rad. But I'm really kind of bummed out and not into I appreciate the effort everyone's going to, but I'm just not really able to get into the kind of virtual club stuff.
I could potentially get into it, but I find the flattening of the, I guess the physical social space to a chat room to be totally useless to me because it's not that interesting to me. I'm not really a chat room chatter. I am someone who, kind of like you were saying, Count, I like to sort of buzz around to various little groups and, I'll hang out with this group and listener converse, and then I'll move over to another group. And I like to move through the space. Mm-hmm. And you can't really do that in these virtual settings as we currently have them. Now you can do like VR type Second Life, WoW, whatever type things, but I haven't seen many of those.
No, nobody's done that.
Really lauded so much, which is odd because I think that would be more the thing that would give both that sense of community and space and transport, as well as the ability to communicate with people. Whereas right now with Zoom meetings or Twitter streams or whatnot, everybody's in the exact same space, and it's simply a matter of just a constant scroll of idle chit chat. Really, there's very little discussion that happens in these
because
forum
you can't
things.
You don't know who's there, right? That's the other thing. You don't know who you're talking to. If the stream is archived, like maybe you don't want to talk about, more personal stuff.
Right.
You can't, if there's a few dozen people in there, you can't have one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. lack of body language, lack of clove smoke. It's really putting into perspective the in-person social aspect of the scene.
Yeah. There's also, there's the kind of like, at least for me, the sort of see and be seen thing where, sure, I enjoy dressing up for myself, but I also enjoy, dressing up for others and seeing how others have dressed up and seeing all of that together. It gets back to that kind of atmosphere, creation of an atmosphere, which I think is important for goth specifically. Maybe industrial scenes are having a lot more fun living in cyberspace, but there's just something to creating an atmosphere. I'm in this room 8 hours or more a day doing work, and then to also sit in this room, it's not the same. Even if I put bats on the wall, there's already bats on the wall. That's not going to help.
There's also not nearly as much fun dancing,
Yeah,
or ordering drinks, or spontaneous
sex in the bathroom,
collaboration.
Oh yeah. That one. Yeah.
That's
that is collaboration.
Yeah, that's true. I'll start with the first paragraph here. Are members of this enduring subculture better prepared for the grim days ahead? Pity the poor goth. 1 minute he or she is minding their own morbid business, back combing their raven black hair into a bird's nest, and planning their outfits, black, and more black. So slimming, and goes with every color of face tattoo. And the next minute, being an introverted loner obsessed with imminent death has become a national pastime. Yeah, so this kind of goes to the thing we're talking about pre-show of, I can't tell if this is parody or somebody being serious.
I really thought it was at first, and then I looked at the other articles this person had written, and it really seemed like it was in the mode of clickbait, trying to be outrageous, and very right-wing, culturally conservative, going off stereotype.
Well, see, that's interesting because
content.
I looked up the author. I felt kind of the same way. And the author's bio, I don't remember most of it, but I remember saying she was a left-leaning feminist. So I thought that was very strange for the content. I thought it was incongruous, but I don't know. I also don't like this idea of, and this comes up throughout the article, but being obsessed with death. Because I know people who are not goth right now that are really obsessed with, constantly checking how many people are dead and the stories of, what's that cliche? If it bleeds, it leads, that kind of thing. I think that's becoming a national pastime. But I think goths are more, at least the goths I know, and maybe I'm idealizing, but I think a lot of the goths I know are struggling with anxiety and depression and are trying to balance being informed with being empathetic and like being concerned about what's going on in the world. And
I think that was kind of the point that the author was trying and failing to make there, though, was that, I mean, the subtext is portraying, goths prior to pandemic had, had cornered the market on the introverted loner obsessed with death. And now everybody's doing it. It's like the bandwagon and the hipsters getting tormented as everybody's listening to their favorite band that they discovered and they were there first, and now they have to find something else to do. I think that's what she's kind of trying to get at here is we had this group of people who were happy in their little niche, and now everybody has come and joined them in it. And so it, I guess, makes us feel more special. But I think to your point with, the people we know who are in the subculture and who are struggling through this time are, not necessarily reveling in this, everybody's joining and we can just be our innermost introvert. And there's definitely a lot of dealing with, depression and anxiety and stuff like that. But there is a lot of that sort of healthy response, reaching out, trying to help other people, trying to guide other people and being that support. And I think part of that is because it's not such a novelty, this environment of thinking about death and morbidity. It's not quite the day in and day out routine that this article is trying to lay it out as, but most goths have at least contemplated and thought about it pretty significantly over many instances of their life. So it's become sort of a thing that is just part of life and not something that's this outsider invading in. So we can roll with that and then take it hopefully in a healthy direction where we can reach out to those who are struggling a little bit more. We can control, our ability to take in this news and information about death rates and spread of the pandemic somewhat in stride and view it with a little bit more detachment and hopefully a little bit more sanity, and not get too panicky about it or too mired in just the weight of it all.
It kind of strikes me that in historical periods where pandemics, plagues, infant mortality, what have you, were more present in everyday life, that it was a more normal way of being to embrace it as an everyday thing. Grimm's fairy tales are a lot darker, lots of photos of people's dead children that just sounds insane to most 21st century people who aren't enthusiastically digging through how people dealt with it.
Well, that I think I have some notes about this later on, but to me, I run into this cliche often enough from the outsider of kind of pigeonholing goths as obsessed with death, and from my perspective at least, and maybe this is just my own perspective, but I feel like it's more complicated than that, kind of to what you were saying, Trey, where it's more of a deeper kind of long look at our own mortality, and then the part where outsiders see it as a death obsession is where I feel like we can generally find an acceptance of death, which leads to that finding the absurdity and the humor and the beauty around things like death when it's appropriate. And because we've realized that we've accepted it as a normal part of just existing, but that's not the same thing as I feel like what's implied here is that we're laughing or joyful about, tens of thousands of people dying in a pandemic. Like, those are not the same things. It's more contextual than that, right? It's finding beauty in the art that has sprung up around death, like a cemetery, not finding beauty in, a parent being separated from their kid and dying in a hospital room. Like, those are two very different things.
Right. Yeah. I've met very few goths who, revel in deaths, revel in, death statistics and, are eager to hear about death and see death and experience death. There's an acceptance that it's a reality. There's a confrontation with it. And there's certainly discussions about it, and there's humor involved in it. There's a lot of black humor as well, but there's not any interest in seeing people die or watching death or anything like that. Even like there's maybe some tangential interest that I've seen on occasion in like snuff films or the fake ones, but I see more people that are really gung-ho about going to see or finding out about snuff films that are not part of the subculture. Than people who are. It just seems to be something that's more fascinating to people when it is considered more of a taboo and more of a thing that nobody should ever discuss, and we're going to bury our head in the sand. So those people who are totally repressing that kind of peek out like, ooh, what's this little thing? I can get some jollies out of this. Whereas those in the goth subculture who oftentimes just embrace it as a reality, not as an aspiration, but just it's a thing. It's another thing in life, and we accept it and we confront it, but we're not obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Well put.
So Trey, I'm still struggling with my voice as I'm recovering from bronchitis. Would you mind actually reading the rest of this article for me?
Sure. All right, let me adjust my microphone so I can stare at the screen while I'm speaking into it here. All right. Goths, for any gentle reader who believes the popular music ended with the death of skiffle, are a youth subculture. Though, as with most originally youth-oriented cults, most members are now middle-aged and having a lot of time on their hands to subtly reflect that a neck tattoo saying Die Young, Stay Pretty wasn't perhaps the best choice, as the firm young skin that it was scrawled upon increasingly resembles a turkey's gnarly nape. They like miserable music by bands called things like Christian Death and Dead Can Dance. You might have heard the excellent pop group The Cure, who were the hit-making tip of the irked iceberg for many years. They're interested in Satanism, witchcraft, and vampires, but, as with many would-be offensive youngsters, there is about them an air of protest too much. One can't help but feel that they are, for the most part, injured innocents who have not been able to adjust cheerfully to our glorious, corrupt world for pleasure and profit, and have thus gone as far as they possibly can to reject it. Basically, a goth is a romantic who is picked last at games once too often.
I like you reading. This is much better. We should have been doing this for a while.
I enjoy reading things too, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't bother me at all.
I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that, Ryan? Or I mean, there's a lot of stuff thrown out there. I think one of the main things was the idea that goths are kind of mindless, rebellious teenagers that want to appear perverted to be special. But I don't know. What do you think about all that?
I mean, for a moment, it seemed like it kind of struck a almost sympathetic chord to the wounded romantics idea. But I also have to wonder if this person would have been kicking kids in black in the 80s or 90s and calling them faggot, you know?
Yeah. A lot of cherry picking, too.
I just really wanted to know where the goth touched them as a child, and can we help them with their obvious, exceedingly large amount of trauma?
Yeah.
It's not the only group she shits on in this either. She actually went out and interviewed a couple of people and then seemingly disregarded anything they said.
Oh, that's right. She does interview somebody. That's right. Yeah. I
took notes.
I feel like that Die Young, Stay Pretty sentiment is directly rooted in like rock and roll culture and has nothing to do with goth. So I didn't appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see that either. I mean, sure, there are some well-documented suicides in the goth subculture, but I wouldn't say it's higher than the norm in a lot of other alternatives and somewhat repressed or...
and they're definitely not valorized either.
No, they're not.
I think
they're usually actually mourned, and there's a loss, and that wasn't a great thing. Yeah. We are really sad about the loss of this, great artist or great member of the community who chose to take their lives, and we consider that often a failing of the subculture because we're here to help guide people through that, and to help them deal with the pain and the torment that's leading them down that path, hopefully in a healthy way. And when we fail at that and the suicide actually occurs, that's not a success of goth in our, morbid fascination with death. That's a failure to properly address thoughts of death.
It also seems like categorizing it as a youth culture. She's getting something about the commercialism around youth mixed in with this now 40-plus-year-old subculture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because, most of the people in the scene, if they're still actively participating, are constantly turning people onto the canon, the Mount Rushmore goths. But I mean, there's tons and tons of newer stuff coming out too. It's enjoyed by everyone.
What is that canon? That's like Black Veil Brides, Evanescence. Who are the other two?
You wound me. I'm a wounded romantic. I'm gonna cry into my puffy sleeves. Thank you.
It almost feels to me like there's that kind of Schrodinger's cat thing going on where goths are somehow simultaneously contrarian children and aging has-beens, because she starts with, they're getting old, but also they're kids who just want to rebel. That is a facet of teenage life, kind of the rejection of the status quo. And I certainly went through that. Some people do, some people don't, and a lot of people have different reasons. There's the kind of um, superfluous or fallow pseudo-intellectual reasons. There's the need to feel like you have some control over your life, and they're just all ways of trying to understand the world. And that's why it bothers me when I hear this kind of derogatory way of addressing this, the formation of identities as a kid and how that process goes, and seeing it as just kind of frivolous, and something to look down on in this kind of arrogant way. And I don't like that at all. But also, even if that's also not the only way that people try to find themselves, right? You have like Greta Thunberg was an example I thought of. She's not just spurning the establishment just because, right? This is much needed activism that the people who run the world are too afraid of or too lazy or selfish to do. And so she's pushing people on something that needs to be done. She's not just trying to be special or something like that. And to me, this is why, when we were talking about, or when I was talking about saying that she was a left-leaning feminist, this feels like the very classic privileged white person position. What was this quote? Injured innocents who have not been able to adjust cheerfully to our glorious corrupt world. It seems it's just this, very privileged white person thing. And I'm of the mind that there is no universal applied standard of society that's being implied here. And I think that, kind of going back to the identity formation thing, that these are very contingent, contextual, and constructed, and not these sort of entities that just exist. And so this sort of writing off of goths as maladjusted, it's to me like the this feels very kind of neo-Marxist structuralism to me, and it just seems lazy and pseudo-intellectual. I don't know.
Yeah, and like you already mentioned, there's a lot of taking both sides of the argument too, and just claiming they're both true, while they are, somewhat, contradictory. And yeah, to go on further on the quote you pulled out of it, the corrupt world for pleasure and profit, and have thus gone as far as they possibly can to reject it. I can think of a lot of subcultures that are much more passionate about rejecting the overarching capitalist norms of society than the goth subculture. That's, one of the big debates in the goth subculture is the influence of capitalist society and consumerism and the acquisition of things, and how important is that? And that's, debated contentiously within the community. We are not a monolith that views the capitalist endeavor, the American dream, as something to abhor and to reject in the most extreme terms. Sure, we came out of punk, and punk is a good example of a group of people who do put more emphasis on rejecting that idea. But I think goth is a more moderate view on that oftentimes too. Whether that's a more practical view or just a weaker view, that's up to another discussion. But we definitely have not gone as far as we possibly can to reject it.
Yeah.
I would also say it's a big enough tent that includes a lot of libertarian gun wielding types that I've met out here too. So,
well, I mean, that is Colorado. That is one of the epicenters of the gun wield libertarian center, whatever it is.
Most of them seem comfy enough not to be in street battles, unlike the weird separatists out on the northwest coast.
That is true.
They're more affluent and pudgy a lot of the time.
Though it is the refuge in the mountains of the Ayn Rand little mental fantasy. So
well,
it's got some libertarian roots, or at least some aspirational libertarian goals in that region.
My inclination is that before long it would turn into a Lord of the Flies type refuge because of all those personality types, but hopefully I'm wrong for them.
Yeah.
All right, Trey, you want to read the next paragraph?
Absolutely. Their essential sacrificial lamb in big bad wolves' clothing nature could be seen in the heartbreaking 2007 murder of the young goth Sophie Lancaster, killed by a rabid mob of teenage boys when walking in a park simply because of the way she was dressed. Her parents said, "We were proud to know our daughter. She was funny, kind, loving, and brave, with a social conscience and values which made her a joy to know. Not being able to see her blossom into her full potential is a tragedy beyond words." More sinned against than sinning, it is the ghost of Sophie who we glimpse in the recently arrived Coronation Street character Nina, a gentle goth girl shunned by the street's narrow-minded bat watchers when she seeks to join their club. As a friend lubriciously puts it, "I used to love sleeping with goths because they were very sweet of nature, total cuddle monsters."
The thing that stood out to me in this paragraph was that last bit, because I don't know, I wouldn't disagree with somebody's personal experience, but I do get a bit annoyed when goths take this sort of try to portray themselves as some superior mating culture. Because I've heard like, oh, goths are all super confident in their bodies and always have great sex, and I've heard like, oh, goths always mate for life, or goths are all non-monogamous and that's, anti-patriarchy, or goths are all super sensitive to their partner's needs and stuff like that. And that gets
right. And then there's the outsider. There's that outsider perspective too that leads to all the abuse within the clubs as normies try to come in and pick up the slutty goth chick, because that's the perception, is that because of the non-monogamy, because of alternative lifestyles and whatnot, simply because they have tattoos and piercings, that means they're easy, apparently. And it's just sort of negative stereotype that gets promoted of the community is really very harmful and also very reductive of the very large, as you already said, Ryan, the large tent of different ideas and different expressions of sexuality and gender and love and relationships and all of this stuff that is still within the goth umbrella. And none of those things are core to the goth experience. There is certainly a more openness to it, but it's not this den of, hedonism necessarily.
Although they're not opposed to that.
Not opposed at all.
Did you guys look up this character from Coronation Street at all?
I only vaguely did. I didn't really look into it much. I just kind of briefly looked up some screenshots and stuff. What did you find?
The only highlights I really found, other than soap opera relationship twists, were she stood up to some boys by punching them in the face, and she's revealed to be homeless. So she's like a fighty, sweet crust punk or something.
Okay.
No, I'm kind of behind that sort of character. I guess the weirdest thing about this particular paragraph here was in my mind at least, severe left turn taken in the very first sentence. I mean, it started with this essential sacrificial lamb in Big Bad Wolf's clothing line. And I'm thinking, where are you going with this? Are you talking about, us acting all tough and dark and scary and trying to go out there and scare the straights and all that stuff? And then it immediately goes into a young girl minding her own business, getting killed by people because she looked different.
A rabid mob, a lot of hyperbolizing.
It is. But I mean, based on the first sentence, the story of Sophie Lancaster, if you don't know it, is like, wait, is Sophie the normal person and the rabid mob of teenage boys a bunch of goths obsessed with death killing somebody randomly? Because that's kind of what the very first line is making my mind go down that path.
That's why I don't know who this article is supposed to be for. Like, who There's both in it's kind of that what's that cliche of knowing two cliches so far this episode. Wow, look at that. Kind of knowing enough to be dangerous. It's like there's
Well, I mean, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect.
yeah,
When you know
sure,
just
yeah.
enough to not know that you don't know everything, so you think you're an expert.
Yeah. There's in jokes, but then there's these weird outsider stereotypes as well. I don't know. It's a mess.
I'm trying to feel out if the point she was attempting to make is that she was the sheep taken down by predatory men or normative men. I don't know. Her she doesn't really have a thesis anywhere in this, so yeah, it's hard to gauge who this is for.
Yeah, which is the difficulty of I think our pre-show chat isn't going to make it in, but yeah, just to repeat myself, it's kind of the difficulty of breaking down these articles because there is no explanation of any underlying framework. It's just here's a bunch of random thoughts. Figure it out yourself. So I feel like I had to do a lot of assuming, what's going on behind the scenes. But
yeah, feel like that's why my thoughts are scattered on it.
Yeah, that I think this paragraph was probably the most egregious in the article, if my memory serves. It just had the most kind of, what the fuck are you talking about? Where are you going with this?
Yeah.
I do not understand.
You start with murder and end with cuddle monsters. It's very
exactly.
strange.
It's like, what?
4-sentence turn.
Leading?
Yeah.
So yeah, that paragraph generally just stuck out to me when I was first reading this.
All right, let's go to the next one.
All right. Sweet though they are, it's still quite easy to laugh at them for the simple reason that, as we're all going to die eventually, and probably reluctantly, banging on about death and trying to make it sexy seems utterly daft. It's tempting when a goth loses a loved one to say, well, now you've got something to scowl about. But observers of the form think differently. The writer Michelle Kirsch says, I never knew a goth who actually wanted to die. It takes a lot of time and effort and money and life to look that dead. But my friend Julia recalls, I was a goth for a while, and a young boy I knew hanged himself. I became a punk then, as death was suddenly brutal and cruel, not romantic, like paintings of Chatterton. I mean, we kind of already addressed that early on, just this total misrepresentation of a goth attitude towards life and death, and this idea that apparently we glorify death and love seeing death and love experiencing death, and the idea that at the end I was a goth for a while and then somebody actually died in their presence, and so they became a punk. Death is brutal and cruel, and that's part and parcel to what we confront when we confront the concept of death. It's not this idealized romantic thing. It's all of these things.
When I was in high school, I did really romanticize death, but I think that was because for me, death was just purely an abstract. But
this is when you were Christian, right?
Yeah. And did
that play into it?
I don't think so. Not really. I think that was my perspective on death was more bucking against Christian thought. Weirdly enough, but
buck against that death cult.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Christians definitely romanticized. Well, okay, some Christians, the Christians I was friends with, especially my parents, did romanticize death in a way that it was to get to paradise kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, just the very idea of a paradisical afterlife to a degree is a romanticization of death.
Sure.
I mean, life is oftentimes viewed as a trial that one must overcome in a good way to get the reward post-death.
Your crowns and jewels and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I get in my personal life, I still really haven't had anybody close to me die other than pets, which I think still count. But my processing of death mostly through philosophical thought, at least as it relates to goth, has been through the kind of, I guess, pervasive ephemera of goth that represents death, and because it's always there, it is something that you do tend to think about. So my thought on it has obviously matured. It's a lot more complex than it was, but I do think what people see as romanticization is really just the celebration of the art around death and the ways that we are able to deal with death through creating and community and building a future and caring for others and that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I think we kind of talked about it, like you said already. But
Yeah. I mean, as far as my experiences with death, I've had, a fair amount, though nothing right there adjacent, like having a good friend hang themselves while I knew them. But, all of my grandparents have passed away. I've been to most of their funerals. Two of my two best friends in high school have passed. I had not been in touch with them for a very long time, so it was at a distance. But my two closest friends from high school died, not of anything tragic, but still they died. And then, I guess the closest to me is when I was in the goth scene down in Champaign, one of a major member of that scene passed away suddenly and young from, a lung condition. And so we had within the scene our own little funeral / celebration of her life. And it was a lot of community coming together and mourning a loss. There was nothing celebratory about it, but it also wasn't this, weeping and wailing and crying and I can't deal with this and how dare the world take this bright soul. It was about what a wonder she was in our lives and how she affected the scene and how she affected all of us and our great memories and all of this sort of thing. And that's generally been my experience with death and how I've seen the subculture and the community that I've been in respond to it. And I personally think that's generally a healthy way to respond to things like that.
And that's kind of reflected in the Sophie Lancaster parent quote, too.
Yeah.
I'm trying to grapple with where she's coming from. Like, is it the pop culture kind of goth talk portrayal where we all want to be sexy vampires forever, or what?
Yeah, probably.
Exactly she's getting at?
Probably. I think that's
one could almost argue, and I think I have in previous episode, that the fact that, one of our primary supernatural beings that is venerated within the subculture is the vampire, which is emblematic not of death, but of cheating death, perennially, eternally, kind of goes against the idea that we venerate death as we know it. I mean, yes, one could argue vampires are dead and they're simply prolonging an undead life, yada, yada, yada. But it's still, it's staying active in the world, staying corporeal forever and not passing, not blinking out, not being snuffed like a candle, as most fears of death are, is this concept of the oblivion, this fact that you are no longer existing, that you cease to be. And, humanity in general has a massive fear of that. We've thought of myriad ways of getting around it or avoiding it. And a vampire is just one of them. There's the afterlife, there's reincarnation, there's ghosts and hauntings and all these things that we've come up with as ways to deal with our mortality. There's nothing particularly, I guess, out of the ordinary in that goth thinks about that concept of how one deals with death, but I think we confront it better and deal with the fact that it happens better than those who just think of it as a speed bump or something that we don't even talk about.
Well, I mean, vampires also explicitly deal with that. Well, in a lot of stories, they explicitly deal with how do you deal with the death of the people that you knew, right? Do you mourn them immediately once you've become a vampire because you know they're going to die? Do you try and keep a connection with them and then deal with watching them age and then die? Like, that's still an explicit theme of the vampire mythos. It's not just only trying to remove death. There's still this kind of processing of the emotion of dealing with death too.
True.
I wonder if maybe that wolf aspect of the sheep's clothing, to use her metaphor, is sort of because it also involves murder perpetually to exist as a vampire, and somehow that's linked up with the image Goth portrays in their mind.
Well, there's also a lot of hard dichotomies in this article, the good and the evil kind of thing, and that's just, at this point in my life, really silly to even think in that way at all about anything. So
certainly in hard and fast dichotomies.
Yeah.
I mean, dichotomies are good poles to see as, competing endpoints of a worldview, but they aren't solitary points.
That was the main drive of the Patreon video I did about the philosophy of justice, when the guy who was in jail for 17 or 18 years for the Sophie Lancaster killing had his sentence reduced. But I mean, you'll have to join Patreon to see it. But it was a lot, kind of explaining that there is complexity of thought even to horrible acts. People don't do, nothing is all good or all bad. People exist in context of other people and society and of politics and upbringing and all kinds of things. Everything is fluid and ever changing. So anyway, I have some theory stuff to get into at the very end. I'm trying to save that. So let's read where we're at. Go to the next thing.
Yep. Whatever one's view, in the past, this has been a private dilemma for individual Goths. But now the pandemic will make us all far more familiar with death on an industrial scale. I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but when I see photographs of the spanking new Nightingale Hospital at the Excel London Conference Centre, I can't help visualizing it 6 months hence and fearing that it will resemble nothing so much as the black hole of Calcutta with added ventilators and vending machines. So what do death worshippers do when it looks like everyone will die? Do they carry on being morbid? Or take the contrarian view and cheer up? I mean, we kind of beat to death the concept of death worshippers, as Goth says death worshippers.
The only thing I could think of would be to ask, like, has what's happening right now changed how you deal with death specifically? Or the idea of mortality? Because for me, honestly, I feel like I'm trying to avoid it for fear of a mental breakdown.
I mean, I can't necessarily say that, my attitude towards death, my view of death has changed significantly with this pandemic.
Yeah.
But part of that is just because I try to pay attention to world events. I don't just stay sequestered. Exactly. I don't stay sequestered in, the safety and sanctity of the United States, in our walled gardens of middle and upper class privilege, because even the United States has its own share of, death and desolation and suffering and pain in poverty-stricken regions, both urban and rural. But I also pay attention to things like the Rwandan genocide and Ebola crisis over in Africa and all the stuff that was happening in Myanmar. So, I mean, I see war and disease and poverty and genocide and sickness, and those are things that happen in this world. And yes, this current pandemic, in my lifetime at least, is the biggest unifying tragedy that's affecting everybody in the world, and is something that no country can just sort of bury their heads in the sand and say it's not happening here, so it doesn't exist. And I think that's what's shocking so many people who have lived in that world where, despite the fact that death and tragedy has been happening at a constant tempo throughout our lives, it just wasn't happening here. And because of that, we could pretend it just wasn't happening. And now everybody's having to contend with the fact that, no, it is happening. And now it's happening in your backyard too. And you're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's definitely seemed a lot more immediate to me as members of my household are forced to go out and interact in a conservative town where people think masks are a conspiracy. And I was saying in the pre-show, I clean up bodily fluids for a living. That seems to be in every single one of those. And one of my bandmates and his wife are immunocompromised with a history of strokes, heart problems. So stepping out of the house to go to practice for him could be a death sentence.
Yeah.
And not to mention the gigging, the live music, goth night, all of that.
It kind of also makes you, Trey, you were talking about realizing the pervasiveness of human suffering. It also makes you, if you never think about it, it kind of puts light to the patina of the social contract that we just assume is there, and that everyone will just kind of take care of themselves. You kind of realize, like, oh no, there's a large group of people who don't give a shit, and that's enough people to fuck the lives of everyone else.
Right. And there are things in this world that individual human beings cannot persevere through, don't have the resources, ability, whatever, to conquer this thing, this idea of this great heroic individual who can forge their own path and blaze a trail. There are things that are too big for individuals. That's why, in my argument at least, the genetic fitness, the Darwinian fitness that led to success of humanity is not individual traits and strength and intelligence, blah, blah, blah. It's our ability to gather together, to gather the resources of a group and leverage those for the best of all. And it's our ability to work together to overcome these things that are greater than any one of us individually.
Yeah. Or you can just inject hydroxyclean and you'll be fine. All right, you want to go to the next bit?
Sure. One thing which will deepen their sorrow is the fact that this month's proposed All Tomorrow's Ghosts musical festival in Whitby has been postponed for the rather ironic reason that we now all stand a very good chance of being tomorrow's ghosts. Optimistically, they've rescheduled it to Halloween, which led me to wonder exactly how we'll be celebrating the annual Ghoul Fest this autumn. I'm not a good Christian, though I do try, but I am repelled by the way death worship for tots often jostles for room alongside merchandise celebrating the birth of Christ. Is there any point in dressing up and running and roaming the streets as brain-dead zombies when you've been getting it at home for the best part of a year?
This article is all over the fucking place.
I just love the entire misunderstanding of what the purpose of Halloween is.
Yeah. I do think the the irony of All Tomorrow's Ghosts, though, is pretty funny.
That was a good turn of phrase for sure.
Yeah, no, that first line, that was a well crafted sentence.
Yeah, I mean,
all right,
go ahead.
We had one positive thing to say, guys. We can move on.
Just
to go off what you said, Trey, the Halloween thing. Like, my mother-in-law loves Christmas, and she's basically doing Christmas shit all year. So why would, when everyone else is doing Christmas shit, make her tired of Christmas? Like, that doesn't even make sense to me. I don't get how she's trying to justify that.
And then there's also the fact that the quote unquote death worship for tots is jostling with merchandising celebrating the birth of Christ isn't some sort of weird calendar coincidence. There are months between the two holidays. It's just that in the capitalist West, Christmas is a big money-making holiday, so the sooner they can start shoving that stuff out down our throats, the merchandising is gonna make more money. And so it keeps pushing earlier and earlier and earlier.
Halloween keeps going earlier and later too now.
A little bit, but not to the same degree.
Not to the same degree. There's no Halloween carols, but
there should be.
The reason Spirit is popping up in every dead mall in the country is because it's highly, highly profitable. So.
True, but it usually at least waits for October. Christmas does not wait for December.
Not this past year. Not where I am.
I will say, because you brought it up, horroraddicts.net, a podcast that's also on the Belfry Network. A couple years ago, they did an episode where they came up with Halloween carols, and that was an entire episode, and it's fantastic. I'll link it in the show notes because I think it was a lot of fun to listen to, and actually it might bring some needed levity to a lot of people listening. But yeah, I mean, I don't get the connection of death either, because that was something that the Christian circles I ran in tried to emphasize as a bad thing. But the Americana of Halloween, specifically in America, I think this person is from England, and it's different over there. But the Americana of Halloween here is really more, when you're talking about death, it's really more just kind of artifice, and it's goofy. It's like hedonistic pleasure. It's almost like another way of processing death, honest, like kind of similar to Goth in some ways. Through the kind of goofy artifice of Halloween to kind of bring light to and understand it. I mean, yeah, there's definitely obviously a capitalist bent to it as well. But it's really not this kind of sinister, oppressive, death-focused holiday that people try to make it out to be, and that a lot of the Christians I grew up with tried to make it out to be. So that I just don't, I had that perception of Halloween for a long time because I wasn't allowed to participate in Halloween. And really kind of Halloween now and trick-or-treating specifically has served as a kind of catharsis with me going out with my son, because I've realized, like, holy shit, this is like it's the whole community coming together, and everybody is nice to each other, and everybody's laughing and having fun and outside, and like it's this beautiful thing that I was kind of robbed of as a child. So Halloween has a very special place to me. So if you come for Halloween, I'm going to shit on your article, I think, is the moral of the story here.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't necessarily have that. I mean, I didn't have any problems with Halloween growing up. My mom's a huge Halloween fanatic, and we did Halloween parties for family friends all throughout my childhood. So I was just very used to that. But it wasn't necessarily a morbid thing. Yes, there's spooky, scary things, the witches' cauldrons and the bubbling dry ice and scary sounds to haunt you at night, sort of soundtrack tapes and LPs. But beyond that, the Halloween parties, that I went to, they were fun. They were people laughing and enjoying themselves and wearing silly or scary costumes and having costume contests and just having a really good time. It's really celebratory. I've never seen it as a sort of scary, spooky celebration of death. And traditionally it wasn't. It was trying to push back against death, because the veil between this world and the afterlife world thinned, and we need to keep the spirits from invading.
Right.
I mean, so it's kind of trying to push death away and getting one ready for winter season, which is the season of just death. All plants die and animals go into hibernation, and we have to subsist on stored goods and hunker down to survive. So I don't agree with their portrayal of Halloween either, though I can certainly see from, I guess, the popular portrayal, especially coming out of the 80s and some of the panics around it and the scary movies and whatnot, where that idea could come from. But that is not a traditional view of Halloween by any stretch of the imagination.
I had a question. Anecdotally speaking, do you find kids are going out as late as they used to, or are as into wandering the neighborhoods? Like, I've been living with a girl who is just aged out of Halloween the last 6 years, at least the trick-or-treating part. They never want to go more than like 2 or 3 blocks, even if parents are with her and her friends. And we go to the rich neighborhoods where they do haunted houses. It's like pretty close to right after sunset for an hour and a half, and then they're done.
Yeah, that's actually, well, at least the trick-or-treaters we get here, that's pretty close to what it is. And then we'll get 2 or 3 either older kids or kids that are out with their parents coming and ringing the bell maybe an hour or so after dark. But it vacates pretty quick.
And I think that's sort of a societally mandated thing. I don't think it's necessarily a cultural change so much as, I guess, just the rise of fear culture
Yeah.
and paranoia, and the idea that, when I was growing up in the 80s, I was a free range child for the most part. I could come and go as I please. I was a latchkey kid growing up too, once I was in junior high and high school. So I would come home. I had a key on a chain around my neck to get into the house. My parents were both working. But yeah, I would walk to school on my own, walk to the park, take a bike ride out to a local Kmart or whatever, when I felt like it. And this is at the ages of like 7, 8, 9. That sort
Yeah.
of existence just doesn't exist. In fact, if you try to do it in today's world, someone will probably call the police on you. And you will be dragged back to your parents' house, and your parents will get a stern reprimand. And if they're not careful, may see a visit from Child Protective Services as well. So we definitely live in a more sheltered world. And I know there are some city ordinances that put curfews around Halloween too, where it cannot happen late. It's not simply that kids or adults don't want to, it's the community has decided, for the betterment and safety of all, that kids should not be going door to door late at night because of bad men in vans and candy.
So I have to kind of idly wonder if some of that is getting transferred onto the imagery of the holiday or something. It's
That's
very odd.
I'd say that's certainly a good hypothesis as to why the attitude towards it has changed and made it seem a little bit more death obsessed. With the razor blades in apples and syringes in the free candy take one bags and whatnot. Paranoia.
There's also going to be handling of candy
Yeah.
this year too. That's going to be interesting.
The disease vector. I've already noticed, much to my great annoyance, that you go to the grocery store and they have those little bins of nuts and popcorn and trail mix that you just grab a bag and you fill and they weigh. Those are empty. They don't sell those anymore.
Yeah.
Which is really annoying because I don't know where I'm going to get my sunflower seeds anymore.
Bummer.
I asked the writer and historian Violet Fenn, who runs the excellent goth website sexdeathandrockandroll.com and is the author of Sex and Sexuality in Victorian Britain, if the response to an actual death of a loved one or a threat of death to oneself, both now real in the time of the virus, is in any way different if one belongs to a cultural group which, in theory, finds death cool and sexy. She replies, I think it's a misconception that goths like death. I can only speak for myself, but I find Gothic culture and literature fascinating because of the potential for eternal life, not eternal death. I love graveyards because they are a physical memorial to those who have gone before us. So long as we are reminded of the deceased, they are never truly gone. In a situation such as the current pandemic, I'm with the majority in that I would really like as few people to die as possible. Will the plague see reinforcements to Goth's legions? Or as death becomes commonplace, will they finally come to feel, well, commonplace? They're not the most original of people to start with. The social commentator Jim Owen noted, Goths seem to be a group for whom other people have done all the imagining. From the Addams family and the Munsters to Susie, they never had to think anything up for themselves. It wasn't a proper fashion thing or even a coherent music thing. It all just seemed like a bad Halloween party peopled by the unpopular kids who were too scared to take drugs, so they made themselves look as though they had taken drugs. It was just novelty music. Monster mash without the rictus grins.
What goth nights is he going to where there's werewolves, Frankensteins, and a bunch of Morticias? Because that's the goth night I need to be going to.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome to see that variety. I mean, I do see the Morticias. Possibly more Lily Munsters than Morticias in general.
She has that sweet spider cape.
Yeah.
And the stripe. Yeah.
But Morticia really feels like more of a homebody where Lily's the sort of party animal. So it makes sense that you go out to the club and you've got the lilies out there doing their thing.
Lilies of the valley, perhaps?
Perhaps, yes.
Well, first of all, I take hella drugs, so I don't know what you're talking about, what this person's
Yeah,
talking about.
I've
Uh,
well, yes, I am basically straight edge. I have never seen the goth subculture be anti-drug. I mean, I've most of the people I've known in the subculture take drugs of some stripe. Are they drug addicts that are just junkies in alleys? Not necessarily. No, they seem mostly to be able to take their substance of choice in moderation, enjoy the high, and then move on with their life. But yeah, a lot of drug use. Don't know where that came
yeah,
from.
and I feel like there's a couple sentiments there. One being the idea that goths are essentially um, the stereotype of nerds, where they don't fit in a social order, so they kind of take their ball and go home. Hey, third cliche, take their ball and go home to make their own club where they can be cool. And then the second is that despite what goths might tell you, there isn't really anything artistic or original about the culture. But for the drug thing specifically, I well, first of all, on a metaphysical level, I disagree because it seems like she's appealing to some essentialist notion of authenticity, that goth is a substitute for a more authentic or real thing, and that goths are just playing pretend, like they're just trying to be the real thing. And I don't like that because, in my mind there is no more real thing, or there is no real. It's just, even if a different group is emulating something else, that's their own co-constitution of reality, which is still just as much a kind of constructed identity as the thing that's being emulated. Because like, I won't go into it too much. I guess if you go back to the evolution of goth episode, I go into it more, but my ontological view is that it's a reciprocal web of interaction all the way down. But okay, so that aside, like, if you read the drug thing, if you read Phantom, because I've been reading Phantoms, like the first chapter of that book is all about how all those kids were doing drugs all the time and how it kind of ruined their lives at some point too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the biographies of individual British goth bands also talked about a lot of those band members doing drugs a lot as well. So yeah, I don't get where that drug idea comes from.
Not to mention all the sad gothic romantics were opium addicts and injecting cocaine and hashish. I don't know.
Or just the concept of too scared to take drugs. I mean, what world are we living in? Is this still like the 60s and 50s now? I mean, drugs have been so normalized in today's society that it's almost an act of courage to not take drugs. It's pushed all over the place. Popular culture is rife with stories of drug use and celebratory escapades. There's no, in my mind, other than in, sort of conservative leading anti-drug circles, a societal sense that drugs are scary. Drugs are something to experience, and there's maybe not enough healthy caution around them. Not that they're too scary. So I don't even know where that part came from either. Other than the concept of the unpopular kid is the straight kid who doesn't party and have fun, where the cool kids are the ones that go out and have weekend benders. That's really the only thing that came from. And that's like 70s, 80s Revenge of the Nerd shit.
Yeah.
But we're sheep in wolves' clothing, don't forget.
So stupid. So I guess I have a couple more thoughts. So the idea that getting back to one of the two main things I got out of this, the idea that goths kind of buck the social order, that because they became disillusioned, so they wanted to create something new. Well, actually, that kind of bleeds into her criticism of the substance of what that something new is being derivative, but maybe I'll come back to that. I think it's silly because I don't agree with the framework, but I feel like what she's advocating is living your life by prescribing to hegemonic social structures and moral structures that are being prescribed to you by that, power dynamic of the political, economic kind of social structure. Like, why? Like, enjoy your totally dull, predetermined life. I don't get why you're saying that's a good thing.
That really struck me with the fashion part of it too. We're unoriginal. We're drawing from popular TV shows as opposed to the characteristic average person's bougie big box store dress that doesn't have much thought put into it.
Right. Well, and so, but see,
question
I don't agree with, I don't even agree with the framework in general, because I don't know if it helps, but like, basically, I think she's making more of an epistemic claim where I'm making an ontological claim, where she's doing this kind of neo-Marxist, structural thing. And kind of making these dichotomous, drawing these dichotomous lines between, these structures that are kind of running everything. But I don't agree with that framework in the first place. I won't get into it too much more. Sorry, Troy. What did you want to say before I keep going?
Yeah, I was just, kind of riffing on what Ryan was saying around the idea that, is regular society this great creative font of novel things?
Right, right.
I'm curious what her, I guess, in her mind, what's the ideal then? What is this society that she puts on the pedestal of? These are the creatives. This is the subculture or group of people that is truly original and truly creative, and why these
well, that's the thing.
It's some shadow of it.
It doesn't exist. It's just an abstract, right? But I mean, like, the writing is sloppy in general. It's not an academic article, so you're not going to get that. But it's just an abstraction of an idealized thing. But that thing doesn't exist, which is the theory thing I'm trying not to get into. So, but I want to talk about like the thing that I mentioned of the kind of the contention that Goth is a copy of a copy, like the critiquing of the substance, the supposed derivative nature of the Gothic. It's interesting to me because if you read Gothic theory, like Gothic literature theory, or even like queer theory, there's a lot of papers that focus on how being a copy of a copy is decentralizing and queering and crafting in like an uncanny experience that is kind of implicitly destabilizing and subversive. And we kind of talked about the uncanny a lot on the previous episode, but I think that in itself can be a way of taking back power and generating or normalizing new ways of being in the world. So I don't think, that gets back to that kind of essentialist thing that we've all been talking about, is, there is some authentic thing, and if it's not the authentic thing, then it's not worthwhile. And the other thing, the last thing I pulled out of this, which was from the quote from who was this? What was his name?
Violet Fenn?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or the Jim, whatever.
The last guy. One. Yeah.
Yeah. So the bad quote, not the good quote. Jim Owen.
Yes. I looked him up and I did a quick Google search and I didn't find anything. But that quote kind of reeks of culturalism to me, which is this idea of it's kind of an elitist way of seeing the world, of thinking that there's some true sophisticated capital letter C culture out there with you kind of get this in your, operas or the theater or your great thinkers, and that's real culture, and everything else is just kind of commerce or the rest of civilization.
All that stuff that just rehashes Greek myths ad nauseum.
Yeah, exactly. And I bring this up because the reason I kind of caught that is because I've been reading about culturalism. So maybe again, this goes back to the I feel like I'm reading too much into what's being said, but I don't have anything else to go off of. But I do feel like that idea of culturalism is kind of a common way of thinking, and I see people doing that a lot of thinking there is this true art form that exists separate from capitalism or commerce. But of course, the irony there is obvious, because you have that same culture is being bought and sold in the same capitalist system. So you're not really escaping that. But I think the bigger problem I have is that it's dismissive of anything that's not deemed to be part of the true authentic culture, whatever that is. And what that ends up being usually is a kind of derision of anything that's not white, and also kind of tends to fall into classist bigotry, but pretends to be populist, which I think we've seen a lot of with the quarantine, or with the pandemic, of like celebrities quarantining on their yacht, telling us that we're all in this together and they're just like us.
We're all in the same boat.
Yeah. Or,
The Titanic.
more broadly, yeah, Jesus Christ. More broadly, the kind of just the general, the sort of the idea that capitalist production is supposed to be all about an individualist ideology. And actually that reminds me of this thing that really bothers me, that I've talked about before. But when I see goths take the piss out of hip hop, or say that, the kind of usage of goth ephemera in various forms of hip hop is like sacrilegious and terrible. It's kind of the same thing, where you're appealing to some idealist notion of culture, but what you're actually doing is taking the piss out of minority communities and, diminishing minority culture. And I think it just becomes a big problem. So I don't know. And I think that all kind of stems from the essentialism stuff that I was talking about before, but
The writer does that on the way out of the article.
okay, well, let's get to it.
Yeah, I was gonna shout that out coming up here shortly, but I do want to do a quick shout out here. I really liked Violet Fenn's quote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did look up that website. I wouldn't say it's a goth
No.
website so much. Death Rock and Roll. It's a personal blog.
Mhm.
Someone who's obviously had some attachment to the gothic subculture, though whether she views herself as part of it or not, still I couldn't really tell. It's not really addressed in at least the first several pages of the blog that I looked over. Definitely interested in the Victorian and Gothic era, and the literature and some of the ephemera of that. But whether she's big on the subculture or really discusses the subculture, I didn't see a whole lot of that on the webpage. But her quote, I love it.
Yeah.
I think it's a great quote. I really want to shout her out for that. I think they did a really good job with that quote. It totally sticks out in this article, and it sounds like something that the author basically had emailed to them and blindly copied and pasted into the middle of the article and did not read.
Yeah.
Because it totally counters everything that the author's been saying
Yeah.
in this article about goths, and I appreciate seeing the counterpoint in there. It's nice to have a voice within the article and not just us trying to be a counterpoint to the massive stereotyping that's happening in here.
Yeah.
But go on.
I was racking my brain trying to think of what she's implying by everybody becoming like goths. The only thing I could think of was like Victorian mourning clothes, cyber goth respirators, the population of plague doctor masks. Like,
I think it's just the main thing is the continuing railing, the kind of picking on the goth subculture because it's viewed as a consciously
Promulgating death.
anti-norm. Not even just that; it's this concept that it's the anti-norm.
Oh, okay, sure.
This perverse view of counterculture where you are counter to the culture
Mhm.
rather than just having to exist counter to the
Yeah.
culture. This idea that we have to exist in a way contrary to the norm, and as the norm
Reflexive.
shifts, that gives us this weird, cognitive dissonance, and we panic because we have to be different and everyone's like us. So what do? Do we wear Hawaiian clothes and go bottle blonde and get suntans? What do we do when everybody becomes goth because of the pandemic? And I think that's what she's continually trying to poke on, is this false existential crisis that she's trying to put on us by saying, when everybody becomes goths, are goths not special anymore? And what are they going to do about that? And the answer is, we don't really
Don't
care.
Yeah.
We're going to keep doing what we're doing. And if you're going to join us, okay, it's your life. Do what you want.
Let me send you a few albums in the mail.
Yeah.
I wonder if the popularity of drugs in the culture at large is why she is assuming that we don't do drugs.
Oh, right, because it's a reaction against. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, it's just too common. We can't do drugs because everybody's doing drugs and we have to be weird and different.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, to sort of
actually that makes a lot of sense. Actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah. But to really hammer home the Count's point about classism and racism, let's go on to the next paragraph. All right. But to be fair, with perspective, all musical youth groups look somewhat silly now. Stormzy getting his knickers in a twist at the Brits seems like something from the age of the Zeppelin or Led Zeppelin. What a piece of trash is rap? All that boasting and demanding respect for owning an expensive watch. Go and stack shelves, then I'll respect you. And BTW, the more bitches you have, the more likely you'll die. Just saying. In the worthless arrogance of rap, we can see the cretinism which harasses the emergency services and loots off licenses. Goths won't do that. Always strongest in the suburbs, they are now hanging on in the provinces. Maybe they will surprise us yet. I can see them, at ease with death, sitting quietly in hospitals, reading Bram Stoker to the old folk, the Goth volunteer squad. Because when the going gets tough, we're all team players, even the undead.
Hey, do you guys hear dogs barking? It's like a whistle went off.
Yeah, something. Actually, no, that's not a dog whistle. There was nothing subtle about that. That was a direct assault on...
No, you're totally right.
To hammer home your point, Count, about this being a very privileged white railing against the minorities and the scary folks.
How dare black people celebrate having things? That's...
Yeah.
What, like, holy shit, man. What are you doing?
And how often have you seen people who stack shelves getting respect on anything?
Yeah.
Well, that's that whole American pull yourself up by your bootstraps bullshit, right?
Yeah.
But this is Britain, where they acknowledge a class system.
Well, that kind of goes to the idea of goths being a middle class thing, right? That kind of runs through the whole article. Because they're suburbanites, which actually, weirdly, this just came up in the Discord a couple days ago. I think it was Catharsis Cat that said they don't understand the emphasis of goth as like a suburban movement, because it seems to be, what did she say? It seems to thrive more in the city. But yeah, I think somebody else brought up that in England it's a much different, it does have kind of a suburban connotation to it because that's where it came out of. But
it's mentioned somewhere earlier in there that it has spread from the suburbs into the countryside or provinces or something.
Yeah, no, it did say that specifically. But definitely it isn't talking about it spreading from the cities and the urban centers and the slums and the places where the ragged people go. It's definitely still portrayed as coming out of this sort of privileged, spoiled child who, just couldn't fit in and so had to make their own thing, but they had the privilege to do that and all of this stuff. It's really all bundled up into that. And yeah, it's really interesting that they had this random paragraph railing against the culture of the urban poor for some strange reason. I don't even know where that came from. I mean, I guess they're trying to talk about, because the whole thing is the perspective of all music youth groups. So just talking about musical youth groups, but I've never seen rap be considered a youth musical group either. I mean, sure, a lot of things like goth, to a lesser degree punk, hippies, psychedelia, techno, electronic drug culture, whatnot. A lot of those Yeah, I could see arguments for them being, especially in their origins, a youth subculture. But rap was a generation spanning just subculture based in a class and, community, not based on race at all. I mean, there is, I guess, to some degree, the generational disparity of jazz versus rap. That was a thing for a while, especially in the beginning of rap. But it wasn't quite so generational as the quote unquote youth group that they're being lumped in with. It just seemed like an excuse for her to go off on rap.
Yeah.
The placement makes me think it's to contrast with the gentle goth reading Bram Stoker to the dying.
Yeah, I guess it does make that last paragraph a little bit more powerful in that they're talking about, well, okay, maybe goths aren't so bad. Maybe their perspective has value in today's times. And maybe as this pandemic continues, they'll be the one taking care of the rest of us. And, that's sort of a nice little utopian view in that last paragraph there. I don't necessarily have any major problems with it. But when contrast with the rest of the article, sorry, it's too little too late for you to come off as someone who's doing anything but lambasting a subculture for little to no reason.
Yeah.
I'd like to note for the listeners that the last sentence has Goth Volunteer Squad and the Undead capitalized.
Yeah.
Yep.
For whatever that's worth, I guess we are the undead.
I mean, I get Goth Volunteer Squad. The Undead capitalization seems a little odd. But Goth Volunteer Squad, that's a proper name. That's an organization. I'm okay with that.
Do they have a Patreon? Bat masks? Plague Dr. Beaks?
Did anybody have other thoughts on anything else in the article we didn't get to?
I meant to read some of their other stuff because it seemed about equally as inflammatory about various groups. Kind of, that's why it astounded me. She classifies herself as a liberal feminist.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I didn't read any. I mean, shortly before joining the podcast, I thought, you know what, I should look up this Julie Burchill. And so I looked, I clicked on her name on the thing to see her other articles, and really just looked at the titles, and some didn't seem too bad, but then some were like, ooh, okay, yeah, you're clickbaity and definitely pulling up some interesting topics that seem to be very contentious. Not necessarily showing, at least in the titles, a lot of nuanced opinion on public affairs.
going after paganism, a little bit of turf content, some seemingly anti-feminist stances from the titles.
Homosexual adoption.
Yep.
Blackface.
Fun. Anyway, you can donate $5 to Spiked. Or pounds. My bad.
Your quarantine weight. Send that in. All right, well, let's on that depressing note, let's move on to the album review.
Album review.
We are going to be talking about the Part-Time Punk Sessions release from Mystic Priestess. And for the kind of synopsis of the band, I actually pulled a quote from the lead singer Sierra out of an interview. And they say, "I started this band because I was going through something called the Saturn Returns. I was having past lives visions of being a priestess in a past life. So I began the band, and the song is portraying empowerment for all femme, non-binary, queer-identifying people to empower themselves with the earth elements and to know that the universe shows you signs that you are taken care of in the world and that we can manifest anything that we want to." So before we get to the album review, we're going to play a track, and I guess I'll just play the first track off of this, which is titled Smoke and Mirrors. All right. I guess I'll share my thoughts first. So, for me, I don't have anything profound to say about this, but I feel like this record was, I feel like somebody sat down and thought, how could we make something just for me? And then they made this. So that's how I felt about it. I am personally loving all of the new kind of death rock bands that are adding mystic elements to their music. So obviously witchhands. But Bastet comes to mind. That's another band I really like. And I think Otzi even does some of that. But yeah, so the album was kind of a mix of anarcho-punk. There was some dreamy kind of post-punk stuff in there, especially in the first couple songs, and obviously a lot of classic death rock. This is the kind of death rock that I really like, though, similar to Witchhands, in that, not to, be too suck off our guests too much. But it's,
I won't stop you.
It's death rock with atmosphere. It has depth to it. And there's a lot of death rock that I won't name bands, but there's death rock that is just kind of hollow and tinny, and it just makes it kind of boring for me. And I feel like this really, it kind of had a soul to it. It's technically good, and you can kind of pick out the influences, but it's got that kind of gothic graveyard backbone to it in there somewhere. It's got sax goth in there, and I'm a big slut for sax goth. Like, give me saxophones in my goth music. It's got I think it was the third track. Let me see. What was that? Eternal Resurrection. Yeah, I think that was the one that had the kind of almost offbeat synth to it, which reminded me of the more kind of experimental stuff that like Malaria was doing. At least that's kind of the reference I got out of it. And obviously there's a lot of like Christian death influence. Some of it's a little more upbeat, which kind of reminded me of Honeybane, was my reference for that. That's another band that I really enjoy. And yeah, there's they did a Rudimentary Penny cover, Peni cover, which is awesome. One of the bands I really like. It's not from my favorite album of theirs, but still a really good cover. And yeah, I thought the vocals were good. There's a good mix of like more kind of the what's more common with vocals now, with a lot of reverb. There's some tracks like that, but then there's the more classic kind of angry shouting vocals, which I also like. So I'm glad they mixed it up. And I don't know. It's got, Trey, I think your criticism is going to be that it doesn't do anything new, but I think they add enough elements and do everything so well that it hits my buttons, It gets my sphincter squeezing open and close, right? It's just, I'm into it. So I really like this album.
Count, you said track 3 was the one that you liked a lot?
Well, that was the one that had that made the synth really obvious, and was kind of offbeat.
That had a very marked keyboard arpeggio thing happening. That definitely had some synth work in it. That was also my favorite track too.
I'm kind of tainted as a casual listener because I'm making similar music and currently trying to record and master some. But I think on that one, I really liked the motif of the chime. I don't know if you noticed that. There's a lyric about a chime, and every time there's a little ting.
Oh shit, I missed that. No, that's good. I missed that.
Yeah, I actually contacted them because I'm really bad at catching lyrics usually, to see if I could read them, but they were like, well, this is not yet. I think what they're doing on this is kind of a more casual demo style or something, because there's 2 songs from their last release on here too.
Yeah.
And I think the keys and the horn are a little more prominent on the versions in here. But let me see my notes. Overall, I liked the melodic lines on the guitar a lot, because they felt like they were being kind of pursued by the bass lines galloping. I also liked the mixing up with the melodic and the barked vocals. But at certain points, they got kind of repetitive. To me, at least. I did listen to this like a dozen times. So, because I mean, overall, I did like it. I think I liked the previous versions of No Tomorrow, Only Today, and what was the other one? Where were you?
Yeah, the last two tracks were the ones that repeated from the previous LP.
But
EP.
I think that's partially just because there's more mixing and mastering. Because overall, a lot of stuff got buried in the mix with reverb and everything. And I couldn't pick out vocals most of the time because of that.
I felt like that with Totenwald's second album had 2 or 3 tracks from their previous album that they redid because they changed band members, which I think is probably why they redid these, because they Mystic Priestess also had like 2 or 3 band members switch, and Totenwald did a similar thing, and I did not like the new versions of those tracks because of a similar reason, that just the mixing was completely different, and I just didn't think it worked. But so that's fair.
There's a bunch of YouTube videos where people go back and remaster old albums in the style of later albums.
Oh, interesting.
I think I've mostly seen it on Metallica ones, but it is, if you're familiar with them, it's a really interesting way of seeing how production affects something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure Metallica got really popular with that just because of all the lambasting of Death Magnetic and its mastering, and the dozens of bedroom producers remastering that to make it good, and or mocking it.
I mean, they really need to lay off the compression. Good Christ. Let's see what else. So I kept playing it in the background, and my girlfriend, every time the horns came on, was like, "Hey, it's Romeo Void." Which I think they sound more Riot Girl than this band, but I got more of a kind of early Susie's and Theater of Hate vibe off the horns. Which, if they come back around, definitely see Theater of Hate. They're fucking awesome live.
Well, we're not going to be seeing anyone for a while, but yeah.
One day.
Yeah.
When enough of us have died, maybe. I don't know. I'm not playing at this morbidity thing, man. Let's see. The content, I listened to their other discography after I got more familiar with this one, and it seemed like kind of had a vibe like a 70s message band, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but I mean, when you can hear the lyrics, it's very upfront. I have a blind spot for drums, but I didn't have any complaints with them. They felt driving. Yeah. And I liked the dated synth noises. I have like a tiny, crappy Yamaha keyboard we use to write songs with all the names of the notes written on it. Makes the same noises. Nice. So that warmed my heart.
I assume with lyrics based on your own band, you're much more into the kind of obtuse, difficult to decipher kind of stuff, right? Rather than, because sometimes I'm in the mood to just shout about castrating the dude that whistles at you on the street and just being explicit in that way. But
there is nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, it depends on the song. It almost depends more on if I'm trying to paint an abstract picture or a scene, you know? My bandmate Lance, who does the other part of the singing and writing, he has a very clear lyrical narrative on stuff, like on Mask and Ozymandias. They're based on 19th century poems, and he really sticks the landing on adapting those without being direct from the text. I've been trying to actually, like, I'll produce like 2 or 3 pages of lyrics and try and pare it down to the most pointed statements I can, and really kind of depends on if I'm going for a direct scene or message or just trying to evoke a mood with it. But seems like the lyrics are pretty direct most of the time. I think my one complaint about the lyrics on this was they kept saying nuclear.
Oh, that drove me off the wall a little bit. Yeah, that really jumped out at me too. I struggled with that one a bit.
I mean, I know there's no organization for how English should be spoken, so I try not to harp on it, but the grammar Nazi in me was like, I guess you could rhyme it differently depending on how you pronounce it too. So
I mean, yeah, I guess it didn't bother me because I was just in a live stream where someone in the comments was going off about how there's this specifically correct way to say these certain phrases and words, and it's like, it's English is just a thing we made up. There's regional dialects. I don't give a shit. Like, whatever. If I understand what you're saying, I don't care. But I totally get why that would bug somebody.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I think overall, I would have liked a little more production polish on it. So that kind of is the most glaring thing I don't like about it. So that knocks it down to like a 6 out of 10, 6.5, somewhere in there. But I didn't get really sick of it or anything listening to it a dozen times either, which it's also pretty short.
Yeah.
So that helped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unless something comes up on one of the individual songs for you fellows, I don't think I have too much more to add. That's
cool
overall.
Cool. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts.
All right.
Go ahead, Trey.
Well, I'll give my take on it. I didn't hate it. So there's that. I will start by saying I am not necessarily steeped in either punk or death rock. Those aren't my preferred styles of music in general. So a lot of the tropes that are valuable within those musical genres aren't things that necessarily really reach me. So I'm sure I missed some of that. In general, though, I mean, I thought the music was good. I thought their musicianship was good. They, were very capable musicians. I enjoyed the guitar work. I enjoyed the drums. I really loved the singer. So I think Sierra did a great job singing.
Good.
I loved the variety of vocals.
I
love the variety.
As well.
Yeah, I love the variety. I love the fact that they were changing vocal timbres. I mean, that's oftentimes one of the things I critique about bands is the dead goth voice that always happens and is very monotone and is very boring. And I don't enjoy that. So I enjoy seeing some variety in vocal styles, from sort of the Susie yelps to, punk shrieks to, the one track I didn't like, which vocals, but it was trying something different, that sort of chanted sloganeering on No Tomorrow, Only Today, which I enjoy some music of that type, but I don't think they quite got the feel of that type of singing just right, and it just kind of fell flat for me. So
I will. I just to interrupt you, normal. I do. There are some bands I think that do the typical droning goth stuff vocals really well, but the one that always comes to mind for me is She Passed Away, which I think is boring as fuck. And the kind of pseudo Elvis. Like, I'm glad people love it, but I can't get on board for that.
So I mean, that's a lot of what I was feeling. It's interesting that you pointed out, as I mentioned, Eternal Resurrection was probably my favorite track, but I found it incredibly distracting, whereas you found the rhythmic interplay between the keyboard and the drums. It's like the arpeggiated synth was, it's an arpeggio, so it's all strict time, but the rest of the band was not on a click track.
Yeah.
and it was totally drifting. And I
Yeah.
actually love experimental music like Steve Reich and Terry Riley, where the entire point is that it's two pieces that phase in and out of time with each other. They're playing the same thing, and then one plays slightly faster, they drift out of time. But it's one thing when there's a timbral coherency between the various components that are
Right.
drifting in and out of time. It's totally different when it's drums and a keyboard, which it was incredibly uncomfortable for me to hear that keyboard line just keep drifting away from the drums
Yeah.
and then coming back in and then drifting away from the drums and coming back in.
Mhm.
I want to give the generous interpretation, say it was a conscious artistic choice, and there is a place for that. I mean, I love my weird polyrhythms and complicated time signatures, but it was just such a small element that was off, and everything else was pretty solid, that it just felt like it stuck out. Whereas if everything was kind of drifting and being complicated and being polyrhythmic, that might not have bothered me. But when it was just this one little element that was like, nope, it's not, and that it drove me up the wall. But I did really love that track, especially because of the variety of instrumental tones that was happening there between the sax and the interesting vintage keyboard sounds, along with the more traditional guitar, bass, and drum sounds, in your punk and death rock type thing.
I think that's fair. I mean, my malaria reference with that band, it's much more obvious that it's meant to be off-putting and experimental, because it's not just one instrument. It's everything is. If it's an experimental track, everything is strange. But I felt like that was kind of like what they were trying to go for. So yeah, but I totally see why that would bother you.
Yeah, and maybe, like I said, maybe being generous, and I don't think it needs to be that generous. I think it would have to be really kind of bad to do that on accident.
Yeah.
But I felt they needed to lean into it more.
Yeah,
like
no, I
they tried to do it
totally
a little
agree,
bit,
yeah.
and because it was just a little bit, it felt out of place, rather than leaning into it, like a math rock band or like a Meshuggah or something that just goes crazy on the weird interplays of different rhythmic meters between multiple instruments. So, I mean, that was that one. And then overall, I found the mixing to be mixed, kind of like Ryan was pointing out. I also listened to the rest of the discography. I probably liked their first EP the best. I mean, Mystic Priestess was probably my favorite, but part of it was probably because the two tracks that the other two albums shared, the Where Were You and No Tomorrow, Only Today, were not tracks I liked. And that was, being very short albums, those were a significant part of both of those albums.
Yeah.
So, but I thought the first album was probably the most interesting, and it was nice to see a band just sort of experimenting with new things and doing their own thing. And I enjoyed that. But I more or less, I enjoyed all three albums. The first two tracks I felt were, in this album particularly, were probably the most poorly mixed, especially around the vocals. Since I did enjoy the vocals so much, I felt those two tracks, those vocals were very buried. And I was having a lot of trouble making them out.
Yeah. At the end of Spiny Wings, you know what that croaking noise is?
I don't even remember it, but no, I obviously don't.
That's track 2.
No,
it's on the outro.
Okay.
So long time ago, I was in the back of my aunt's car, and she's a nurse, and I started going, I can't do it very well. My throat's dry, but...
Is it a death rattle?
Yeah. Okay. Apparently that's the sound corpses make when gas is escaping them.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah. Not exactly a death rattle, because it's not right when you die. It's when they've been sitting around in the morgue and it's creeping out of their lungs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I got yelled at by my aunt who's worked in a morgue.
That's pretty goth. That's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was,
there we
that
go,
was sort of my
being
main critique of those first two. And that it didn't start my, I guess, experience of listening to the album well, when I was like, nah, they seemed like they were decent tracks, but as the Count already said, is possibly my critique, though that isn't my critique of the whole album. But those first two tracks I felt were a little bit, they're there. They're okay. They weren't really doing anything interesting, but the later ones definitely did a lot more interesting things, and I really enjoyed a lot of them more. I actually did like the Rudimentary Peni cover, though the main critique I have of that is it was a pretty straightforward cover. There wasn't a lot of reinterpretation, though they fixed the ending. Because the Rudimentary Peni song just stops.
Yeah, I just re-listened to that.
They actually
today.
ended.
Yeah.
Which one was it? I'm not
The
familiar.
song,
Blissful
it
Myth.
was, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't have been familiar. I wasn't familiar with it
From
either.
their first album.
Yeah, when I saw that if they had not put Rudimentary Peni in there, I would not have known because I'm not familiar with the band.
Yeah.
But I did go and listen to the Rudimentary Peni album, or not the album, but the track, and then listen to this one. It's interesting that their version is longer, but it's also faster than the original. But that's because they actually put an ending on it and didn't just stop.
I have a rudimentary. I have a Rudimentary Peni back patch on one of my vests, and just a few weeks ago, my father-in-law asked me what that meant, and so I had to explain that to him. Which, for anyone listening who doesn't know, the reason they named the band Rudimentary Peni was because when I think it was the lead singer was in elementary school, their biology class talked about the clitoris as a rudimentary penis, and he thought that was hilarious, so that's what they named the band. So I had to explain that story to my father-in-law, which was
fun.
Yeah, interesting.
Probably would have been better than explaining it to your father.
Well, I don't talk to him, so problem solved.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I thought they did a decent cover, but I'm a fan of covers that really reinterpret things, and I don't necessarily really like covers that are doing it over again, more or less the same as straight on cover.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they did a solid job of it, and like I said, I like that they fixed the ending. And I did kind of like track 5, even though I said it really didn't really grab me, but it was up there among the better tracks. But yeah, track 6 I had a lot of trouble with, and it was because of that sort of monotone, sort of chanted. I felt as sort of a chanted sloganeering type protest song vocals, but I didn't feel the passion behind it. It just felt a little bit flat to me. I think that also might have been the one that had Nuclear in it, so I don't think that helped.
Yeah. I think that was my favorite track for the guitar, actually.
Okay. Well, like I said, my main complaint on that it was vocal. And then also, we kind of talked about the lyrics. I tend to like more elliptical lyrics and things that are hinting and more open to interpretation. I felt they were very, very on the nose and just right out and saying it. And that doesn't grab me as much. I didn't think they were necessarily bad, though. I thought a couple of things felt a little bit awkward and were a little too on the nose. But overall, I mean, the topics they're dealing with, the concepts they're dealing with on all of their albums, I thought are interesting, and I appreciate the conversation around those things. But I just like a little bit more nuance and complication, in my lyrics. But again, that's my taste in lyrics.
You're a fancy bitch. That's okay.
I'm a fancy bitch. I like my singer-songwriters. Give me my Nick Caves and Leonard Cohens and that sort of thing. That's, again, one of the many reasons that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of punk and some of those more straightforward. They tell you exactly what they feel and they're going to shout it at you. And I don't enjoy that, though. I do enjoy the weird punk bands like The Fall, though you could argue they're post-punk /
I'd probably say post-punk, but
whatever. But that's also why I gravitate towards post-punk over punk, in that post-punk is punk, but with more of an experimental and weird, quirky edge, where punk is very straightforward, very garage rocky, very traditionalist. So that's kind of my take. I'd say I was mediocre on the album. I was pretty lukewarm to it in general.
Yeah. Well, this reminds me of our review for the still most recent Dinah Lakayam album, which I gave a 5 out of 5, and everyone else said was not very good. But
you're also you're a ride or die Lakayam fan.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. I was gonna make a pegging joke, but at this point, it's not worth it. All right, so
insert your own. How about that?
There you go. Perfect. Wordplay. That's right. There you go. That's lyrics. That's half of a song right there.
There you go.
All right, cool. So let's wrap up with Sinister Suggestions.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
My suggestion is the show Happy, which is available on Netflix now.
Yes.
I am halfway through the second season, and I actually stopped watching it because I didn't want the show to end. But it stars the dude from some crime drama on network television, but in a completely different role. And it's I don't know, it's frenetic, it's absurd, it's classified as a dark or black comedy. But it's a lot more than that. And oh man, I didn't make any notes for this suggestion because it's so difficult to try and summarize or talk about the show without ruining the experience of it. Because I went into it, I literally just started episode 1 knowing absolutely nothing about it. And holy shit, was it a fucking ride. And I think that's probably the best way to experience it.
How about telling us what brought it onto your radar and what piqued your interest in it in the first place?
So it was just it popped up on my Netflix suggestions, and the trailer that played for it wasn't a trailer, it was just the beginning of the first episode. And the beginning of the first episode is him in like a disco fever dream, blowing his brains out, and then he's in the back of a ambulance, and this blue unicorn shows up and starts talking to him. So he's screaming at these paramedics and telling them what drugs to give him after he just like murdered 4 dudes. And then there's this imaginary friend unicorn thing that's talking to him. And I was like, I have no idea what the fuck is going on. I have to watch this. And so it just gets crazier and crazier from there.
So kind of what made me watch like Adventure Time the first time. It's just this bizarre off the
Yeah,
wall,
it's just so
what the hell
absurd.
is happening?
It's like at least my first impression. It's not really in totality like this, but my first impression was this is similar to the kind of absurdist humor that I'm used to seeing on the internet. But it has a lot more depth and pathos and character development and story to it. The second season is very different from the first, but I think also good. So if any of that sounded interesting, I would suggest checking it out. I don't want to say much more here.
I've seen both. They're phenomenal.
Yeah.
And cast is great.
The cast is
and
amazing. Oh my God.
And if you know Grant Morrison's work, it's very much in his vein.
No, that's a good reference. Yeah.
No, it's his work.
I mean, it's his comic.
Oh, did he write that? Okay, I didn't even know. I've read
and produced the show. So
he produced the show. Holy sh! I've read a fair amount of Grant Morrison. I'm surprised I didn't know that. Yeah, well,
you didn't read the credits?
No, I don't read the credits.
Or you didn't
Netflix
do what I
skips
do and
the
go to
credits
the
for you.
Wikipedia page immediately.
No. I have 3 jobs and a kid. I don't have time for that shit. That's awesome. Well, that's great because I love everything I've read from Grant Morrison. I've absolutely loved. So that makes a lot of sense.
You should read his book too.
All right. I'll put it in my list.
Yeah. This is also not goth, so beg your pardon. Overlords, don't drum me out. So I don't know. Sometime in high school, I was way into this Metallica cover of Astronomy by Blue Oyster Cult. This is a little journey. So I found the first album I could with that on it by Blue Oyster Cult, put it on, and was exposed to this comic booky, way overproduced guitar and keyboard driven rock opera that is the black sheep of their discography, and it's like way closer to metal than anything else they ever put out, because it was never meant to be one of their albums. But the weird thing is, like, their whole discography has ties to it, because their producer or manager, I guess, had a epic story inspired by H.P. Lovecraft that spanned centuries, like the Age of Exploration and the occult causes of World War II and alien human hybrids and evil artifacts, and runs the gamut. And he never completed it, and he made this incredibly expensive album that the label would only market as a Blue Oyster Cult album, and then put out this part 1 of 3, scrambled the order all of the story tracks go in, and never touched it again. Died a few years ago. And ever since I heard this album, it's called Imaginos, by the way, about every year or two, I just can't get enough of it, and I start listening to it again for about a month. And I'm just coming off the end of my semi-annual obsession with it, and I just discovered a YouTube documentary all about it called Imaginos 1988 Blue Oyster Cult's Occult Rock and Roll by Not Lost Media. It's almost an hour and 3/4 long. Deep dives way into the story that was never fully realized, and it's very niche, and I don't know. I found the more you arrange it in a logical story order, the more it resembles a musical, and the less I like it. I think I like the bastardized label order. But yeah, it's worth a listen. There's a couple songs that I listen to frequently when I want to get a certain mood when I'm doing a song, like In the Presence of Another World, or I Am the One You Warned Me Of. And I think most of the Blue Oyster Cult fans are like, I just like the season investiture of Castle Frankenstein in Wallachia or something ridiculous like that. But if you like 70s, 80s overproduced butt rock, you would have a hard time finding more guitar and keyboard overdubs and styles of songwriting than this abomination Imaginos. So that is my sinister suggestion.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Actually, while you were talking, I was just looking at my bookshelf, and I have Grant Morrison's The Filth graphic novel collection, whatever that's called. What is it called when you put a bunch of comics together?
Graphic novel?
There's another
another term for it. It's
but anyway,
well, it's an anthology with books, but I don't think it's that for comics.
Yeah, but it reminded me that has
trade
a
paperback.
Trade paperback. Yeah. It has a kind of police detective that's also a chimpanzee in there, which is a similar flavor to Happy, and I really loved The Filth. So anyway, sorry, sidetrack. I was looking. I was like, I feel like I must have some Grant Morrison within reaching distance.
Further sidetrack, his book I was recommending is Super Gods, because it's part delving into his chaos magic practices and part biography and part history of the comics industry.
Oh,
pretty cool read.
When do you know when that came out? I feel like Grant Morrison changes every decade or so, just a bit.
He actually addresses that in there.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
cool.
All right, let's see. Amazon has a paperback from 2012.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Trey, what do you got?
All right, so I've struggled a little bit. I mean, I've been kind of listening to a bunch of different things and checking out a bunch of different things and trying to prep for all these sinister suggestions because I never have any idea, and I always scramble at the last minute. But so this week I've got an album from an artist that I discovered relatively recently, Katie Gately. Her album is Loom. It's her second album. She's primarily sort of a musician and producer. She does a lot of sound design and sort of sound collage type things. So she's not really an instrumentalist so much as just she takes found sounds and samples and mashes them up and jams them together and sings over them. So she is a vocalist too. So it's a lot of her voice, usually multi-tracked over a very interesting, oftentimes, soundscape of found sounds and things like that. Sometimes it's very chaotic, sometimes it's kind of industrial in feel, and sometimes it's a little bit more atmospheric and things like that. So this album was actually one that was inspired by a tragedy. Her mother had passed away of cancer shortly after the first album when she was working on a second album, and she kind of shelved that second album and made this from that place of having lost her mother. So there's a lot of tragedy, a lot of darkness in it, and a lot of reflecting over concepts of illness and cancer and things like that as she's just sort of processing this event in her life. And I just, I listened to it and I was just struck by the sort of the mood and the atmosphere of the piece, the use of the vocals and the multi-layered, multi-tracking of her own voice. And I really enjoyed it. So I highly recommend it. I think it's a great album. People should check out if you're interested in, anything that's, vaguely experimental, but it's not like really avant-garde. It's not like Neubauten or
Diamante Galas.
Sort of noise, or it's not Diamante Galas. It's not that sort of tortured screaming and pained vocalizations. It is the singing is more musical than Diamanda at her most diabolical, though Diamanda has some great musical pieces too. But it's definitely not that sort of experimentalism. It is very musical. I don't think it's a hard listen, perhaps emotionally draining, but not that sort of a challenging, I'm not sure if I like this sort of noisy type thing. It's not that kind of sound collage. She puts things together in a way where they're not quite so jarring. But I found it a very enjoyable listen. I think people should check it out.
Awesome. Ryan, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun. I feel like, well, actually, before I get into pleasantries, why don't you let us know on the way out again where people can find witchhands?
All right. Let's see. Witchhands.com is the website if you want to buy CDs, T-shirts I print, all in-house. That's where all the money goes directly to us. You can also find us on Bandcamp, Spotify. I think we've been digitally distributed everywhere. Let's see. Fairly active on Facebook. Try and put some of the cool band photos up on Instagram periodically. We actually have a Twitter. Although some of those spots you have to look for witchhands.dxr. So, and then I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at ryan.flint. So
cool. Yeah, and I was just gonna say I was thinking through the course of our discussion about how I feel like just how lovely this was, because I feel like we've become relatively good friends, but we've never actually, it's one of those internet friendships. You don't actually talk to somebody or see them in real life, but you talk about stuff, personal stuff fairly often. So for me personally, this was quite gratifying and lovely to have a chat with you. So
agreed. It was, well, it's not every day you get your first phone call with a friend recorded, is it?
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so before I tell you what we're going to be doing next episode, I would like to take time to thank our Patreon members. These are the people who have supported this podcast, made it possible for you to enjoy or hate or critique or complain about the last 2 hours or so of this episode, and to bring conversations from the community, much like our episode, there go my dogs, much like our episode from a couple weeks ago, out into the public, and to provide this resource and community for all of you. So I am eternally grateful, and this is why I take the time to read out your names. So let's start with our founders. we have Esmeralda, Abigail, SJ, Cadaver Kelly, Jason, Junkyard Bat, and Samantha. At the Nocturnal Council level, we have Christine, Nephilim Incorruptus, Skullgirdle, Natalie, DJ Azzy, Mike Mess, Dawn, Fifth Dream, Amy, I Am Ruin, Sav, Jacob, Michelle, Jen, Sebastian, Hayshaker, Moses, Felina, and Top Down Tom. And at the Crow's Call level, we have Isabel, Dom, Angel, Alex, Anne, Heather, Marissa, Swampire, David, Alex, Kelly, Dagger Dance, Caroline Carnivorous, Alana, Irene, Susan, Kay, Mark, King Rhinex, Jonathan, Wolfie, Jason, David, Morgan, Kevin, Eduardo, Jan, Richard, Gendalis, Isabel, Elizabeth, Jennifer, Kevin, Bruce, Enya, Keen, Anne, Death Metal Kumbaya, Laurel, Ava, Stuart, Nia, Martin, Dryas She, Gateway Goth Events, Morgan, GPS, Two Broke Goths, Eternal Winter, Megan, Nick, Esther, Paul, Laura, Rebecca, Leah, Captain Faust, Ryan, Master Squirrel, and Stoles in new Goth font there. So thank you all so much for your support. It means the world, and I hope you're happy with the show. As always, you can email me, cemeteryconfessions@gmail.com. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be back July 2nd, and we'll be having an interview with Martin Oldgoth. Yes, the Martin Oldgoth. You may know him from starting World Goth Day, or just from DJing and promoting goth music wherever he goes. We're going to be chatting about, well, predominantly goth music, the history of it, the relevance of it, the themes of goth music, what it's meant to him. We'll be talking about World Goth Day and the state of the scene and his life experience as a goth. So I hope you'll come back for that. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us. Until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.